And in 1947, after the war, an American Zionist named Baruch Korf was in Paris. He was connected to the Stern Gang, and he and his group in Paris decided that they would fly an airplane over London and drop incendiary bombs on the foreign ministry.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We'll begin with the Connecticut Climate March. Now, whenever you talk about climate, you have to start with the grim facts revealed in 2013 by the World Bank. Their report said that we're on path to a monstrous 4-degree centigrade increase in world temperatures, 2 degrees above what UN scientists have said is at all safe. And nothing has been done or planned in the last 2 years to alter that route. On the last day in May, around 500 people gathered in Hartford, Connecticut to march for a livable climate.
We don't want your gas or oil!
Keep the fossil in the soil!
I interviewed Ben Martin of the Connecticut branch of the worldwide climate activist group 350. The branch is called 350 Connecticut. Ben, we're seeing a lot of 350 Connecticut signs at the rally. You're one of the groups that sponsored this action. So what about those demands that you talked about in your speech, things that Connecticut and the nation needs?
So we're calling for 100% renewable energy, a stop to the frack gas infrastructure, end of environmental racism, and guaranteed jobs for fossil fuel workers, because it's the only way the planet's going to survive. It's the best way to get people's jobs, and it's the best way to improve our society to a point where it's fair, it's just, and we all can live with each other in harmony.
Some of those slogans are self-explanatory. What do you mean by environmental racism?
Well, you see in Connecticut and in like a lot of other places, the poorest towns, the poorest cities are always where they put the coal plants, they put the natural gas plants, they put all the stuff that's ruining the air and ruining the water in places where people are poor and they're working class. And you don't find a coal plant in Greenwich, you don't find a coal plant in the middle of LA. It's just a matter of because the people with money don't want it there. And so we need a just society where everyone is being affected, even though we know even the rich are being affected by climate change, but they don't see the everyday effects of the cyanide and the mercury coming out of these pollution plants. And we want everyone to have a nice place to live where they can live in harmony with nature and have a nice place to live. So we want to get these fossil fuel pollution plants out of their neighborhoods.
And in Connecticut, we see the only plant in a poor section in Bridgeport.
In the poor section of Bridgeport, and they want to add a natural gas plant there too, which is going to be just as dangerous, not only for the general climate, but for the neighborhood that it's in, because not only do you get the pollution that's coming out of the smokestacks, but you have the danger of explosions from toxic natural gas coming into their neighborhood.
Right after the march, Anthony Zorge of Capitalism versus the Climate spoke via the People's Mic.
I'm a member of Capitalism versus the Climate.
I'm a member of Capitalism versus the Climate,
Which is the Connecticut chapter. Of Rising Tide North America.
Rising Tide North America.
For the past year or so, we have been involved in a fight. Against Spectra Energy.
Earlier, I had interviewed him.
Is the fight against Spectra Energy and their plan to expand the fracked gas pipelines in the New England area to bring gas from the Marcellus Shale, which has already been ravaged by the fracking boom, through New England up to the maritime provinces and the LNG export terminals there, so it can be exported for profit for Spectra. So we're trying to hopefully build up some energy that people can get tapped into the upcoming week of action against Spectra starting on June 6th, so people can start organizing some direct action or get involved with groups like CBC or FANG in Rhode Island who have been fighting for a long time against Spectra in that campaign.
What's the matter with what Spectra is doing? They call it natural gas. Sounds nice, natural.
Yeah, I mean, aside from all the climate change implications of methane gas, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas, fracking is destroying communities in the Marcellus Shale, and the gas that's going to be brought through these expanded pipelines is going to affect communities in New York and Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. The capacity of the compressor stations along the pipeline is going to be increased, which means the amount of methane and formaldehyde and volatile organic compounds leaking out of those compressor stations is going to be even higher than it already is. And most scary is one stretch of the pipeline expansion is going to be dangerously close to the Indian Point nuclear power plant, which could result in a catastrophic explosion if this pipeline exploded, as many of them do.
The march was a nice effort, but we have to be honest. The rush to climate catastrophe is one of the most perilous issues facing the human species. But only one elected Connecticut leader attended the rally, and there was not one trade union sign, and the corporate media didn't attend. More complete video of the rally and the march at our website, thestruggle.org. Now for the last part of Alison Weir's talk. Weir is president of the Council for the National Interest. She's written the book Against Our Better Judgment.
As early as 1915, according to Peter Gross, a leader of the Parashim suggested that the British would gain a benefit from a formal declaration in support of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Some of you that have heard of the Balfour Declaration might be connecting that. I'll get into that in a little while. But many people might be wondering, why would the British benefit from that? Huge as the British Empire was, it did not contain Palestine. Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire. So why would it matter to the British? What would they benefit from such a declaration? Well, let's remember what was going on in 1915 in the world that involved Britain, and it was what they called at the time the Great War, World War I. Britain was fighting Germany, and the Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany. Britain at times. So the British at times were losing this war. They, at the first day of the Battle of the Somme, a battle that went on for months, the British casualties for one day of battle were 60,000 men. So they were desperate for help. They wanted Americans to come in on their side, and the Germans also wanted Americans to come on in their side. There were, British Americans and German Americans, many of both types. But the American public was that apparently bad thing, isolationists. They didn't want to go to a foreign, foolish war to kill and be killed. Woodrow Wilson was elected to his second term of office with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." The Zionists saw this carnage as an opportunity, especially a man named Chaim Weizmann, who was a British Zionist. So he went to the British government and he claimed that the Zionists, through their colleagues in the United States, and they specifically mentioned Louis Brandeis, who was close to Woodrow Wilson, they claimed that their colleagues in the United States could work to push the United States into that war on the side of Britain. If Britain would promise that once they won that war against the Ottoman Empire, that they would then sort of facilitate the Zionist objective of taking over Palestine. This is called the Gentleman's Agreement. It's mentioned in a number of books, and this is how the Zionists got the Balfour Declaration, as it's called, in which there was a letter that said that Britain would view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, as long as it didn't impede all those non-Jews, it was 90%. But this declaration is considered significant because it sort of opened the door for Zionist and Jewish colonization of Palestine. By the way, the Balfour Declaration was written to Lord Rothschild, who was the head of another Zionist leader in Britain, but it was not written by Lord Balfour. It was written by a different individual. I have that person's name in my book. I think you'll be surprised to learn who it was. And the text for the so-called Balfour Declaration went back and forth between Britain and Zionists in the United States before the final text was finalized. After World War I was the Paris Peace Conference, in which the winners divided up the spoils, and Britain was given the mandate over Palestine. It then did open Jewish immigration to Palestine, and not surprisingly, that led to violent conflict. Indigenous people don't want to be pushed off their own land. So there was violence on both sides. Innocent lives on both sides were lost. Then as now, the large majority were the Palestinians. Among the Zionists, some started two terror groups called the Irgun and the Stern Gang. The leaders of these two groups later went on to become prime ministers in Israel. But we're focusing on the U.S. aspect. It turns out that these had front groups in the United States that were working on their behalf in many ways, including funneling money and weaponry to those terror groups and other paramilitary groups in Palestine. One of them, a man named Hillel Cook, was the Irgun operative. In the United States, he went by the name of Peter Bergson. Another man from the United States. So during this time, now that we're talking about the 20s and the 30s, Britain would periodically, would try to restrict Jewish immigration for periods because it was causing so much conflict and violence, that now and then they would reduce and restrict Jewish immigration. So when they did that, the Zionists grew to hate Britain. And in 1947, after the war, an American Zionist named Baruch Korf was in Paris. He was connected to the Stern Gang, and he and his group in Paris decided that they would fly an airplane over London and drop incendiary bombs on the foreign ministry. The first target had been Parliament, but then they decided that they hated the foreign ministry even more, so that was the target. They had the money, they had the plan, they had the plane, but there was one problem: they didn't know how to fly it. So they recruited a young American aviator who'd been an ace pilot during World War II, a man named Reginald Gilbert, to fly the plane for them. Gilbert pretended to go along with the plot, but then he secretly went to the American embassy, and they then went to the Paris police and Scotland Yard, and that plot was foiled. Korf was arrested, but he eventually got out. He had powerful friends in the United States. I was very curious about what happened later with Korf. I hadn't heard about this anywhere else in the other books that I've read. No other book seems to have this information.
Is now closed.
So I was curious about what happened with Korf, and I discovered, by the way, this was headline news in newspapers all around the United States. There were headline stories about this. In Britain as well, in Australia, it was a major story. Later in life, it turned out that Rabbi Baruch Korf became close friends with President Richard Nixon. In fact, Nixon fondly referred to him as his rabbi. It was reported that Korf even played some sort of role in influencing Nixon's Middle East policies. Now, all of this, of course, that I've described to you is the precursor to the very powerful Israel lobby that we see in the United States today, a very pervasive lobby. The most well-known entity within that lobby is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Fortune magazine places that usually in the top 2 most powerful lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C. against Congress. The precursor to AIPAC was founded in about 1939, AZEC, and by 1943 it had a budget of $500,000 when a nickel bought a loaf of bread. By 1948 it had access to a far larger fund that was the equivalent in today's dollars of $1 billion, with which to propagandize and manipulate the American public. So with that money, and this is well documented, this isn't archaeology, they had written reports about what they were doing, there were written documents, etc. So with that money, they targeted every sector of U.S. society, congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, business and labor, Jewish war veterans. Because I may have forgotten to say this already, Zionists during these decades were a small proportion of the Jewish American population. Most Jewish Americans originally were not Zionists. The large majority were not Zionists, and there were a number of individuals and organizations that were actively anti-Zionist. So they had to be propagandized as much as anybody else, and actually eventually I feel more. So with that money, AZEC created hundreds of committees around the country. They funded books, made them major bestsellers. They also worked to manufacture Christian support. There were 2 Christian organizations that they sort of helped to create and funneled money to that would push Zionism. During this period, as I sort of suggested, there was opposition to Zionism among many different parts of American society. Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, the Pentagon, State Department, etc. Some of the most distinguished pastors in America opposed Zionism for religious and moral grounds. American religious leaders in the Middle East, Christian leaders, went to the Paris peace talks to specifically oppose Zionism and to specifically advocate for self-determination for the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, for the Palestinians, to have self-determination. That's what Woodrow Wilson was talking about at the Paris peace talks. A well-known, very prominent Dead Sea scholar named Miller Burroughs wrote a wonderful book called Palestine is Our Business, in which he said that it was all Americans' responsibility to. A Jewish author named Alfred Lilienthal wrote several excellent books also opposing Zionism and exposing what it was doing. He was a member of the American Council for Judaism, which was led by Rabbi Elmer Berger, who was also anti-Zionist. The government, the American government, was opposed to Zionism, starting with under President Taft. The Secretary of State opposed Zionism. Under Woodrow Wilson, Wilson sent a commission to Palestine to investigate the feasibility of a Jewish state being created in Palestine. They came back and said that this would represent a grave trespass on the rights of the people there. Zionism should be abandoned. It was a very, very powerful report, but it was buried and had no impact. Then we had the State Department and other agencies issuing study after study, memo after memo, report after report, saying that Zionism would be detrimental to American interests and would hurt Americans. A major statesman named Dean Acheson said that supporting some Zionist objectives would imperil not only American, but all Western interests in the Near East. The Secretary of Defense was outraged that a domestic political lobby was pushing policies that would endanger Americans. There are many such quotes. They're in my book. I won't go through each one of them now. But Harry Truman responded the way every president has pretty much from both parties, and both candidates are still doing that today. What Harry Truman said to the State Department officials was, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents." He was in a close race for the presidency for an election. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, said that he wouldn't even vote for him if Truman would sacrifice American interests for the sake of an election. But of course, we know what Harry Truman did. Dewey was doing the exact same thing. After World War II, the British finally gave up on Palestine. It had become so violent in all respects that the British turned the question of Palestine over to the United Nations to solve. At that point, the United Nations could have acted on its charter principle, which was self-determination of peoples, but instead, what could have been done is there could have been free and open elections in which the people living on that land would create their own government and have their own elections. But instead of doing that, the Zionists pushed through the General Assembly something called the Partition Plan, the Partition Recommendation, in which Israel, a Jewish state, was being given 55% of the land. And the Palestinian state, as they were recommending it, would be getting 45% of the land. Even after decades of immigration, the Jewish population was 30% of the land and owned well under 10%. But they were getting, according to this plan, 55%. This was pushed through by bribes and threats. It's well documented. The Zionists were often very proud of what they would do and would write about how successful they had been. So it's important to note, many people think and are often told that the UN created Israel. Well, if the UN created Israel, it also did create a little Palestine, but it didn't create either state. This has no force of law. It was never adopted by the Security Council and never became international law. The way Israel was created was through warfare. Israel calls this its war of independence. Palestinians call it al-Nakba, the massive catastrophe, because it was a massive humanitarian catastrophe of ethnic cleansing. Over at least 750,000, probably more, men, women, and children were very ruthlessly put off their land, pushed off. There were numerous massacres. These are detailed descriptions are available of what they were like. 16 of those massacres occurred before a single Arab army finally joined the fray. Once the Arab armies joined the fray, they were smaller in numbers, overall numbers, than Zionist forces, the opposite of the myth that most of us grew up believing. Now, after this happened, an American journalist tried to tell Americans about this. Her name was Dorothy Thompson. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia, Dorothy Thompson was one of the most famous journalists, the most important journalists of the 20th century. They even write, I believe, someplace that Dorothy Thompson was the most important, most powerful female journalist of the 20th century. And yet most of us have never heard of her. And yet she was considered the most powerful woman next to Eleanor Roosevelt in the United States. She was extremely important. She had a radio program listened to by millions of Americans, a newspaper column that was in newspapers across the United States. She was such a celebrity that there was a Broadway play loosely patterned on her in which she was played by Lauren Bacall, and a Hollywood movie in which she was played by Katharine Hepburn. She was an amazing journalist. She had been in Germany during the 1930s and was one of the first foreign correspondents to alert the world to the rise of the Nazis. She was, in fact, the first foreign journalist to be expelled by Hitler. She was therefore very sympathetic to Zionism. But then after the war, and after Israel was created, she went to see this wonderful new Jewish state that had been created. And there she discovered hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, many of them dying every day under extremely harsh conditions. So she began to write about them, to tell about them. And for trying to tell Americans about these people, she eventually made a documentary. For doing that, she eventually lost her radio program. Not eventually, fairly quickly, she lost her radio program. She lost her newspaper column, and she lost her fame. As her biographer puts it, she was erased from history. And today, if I tried to write about Dorothy Thompson for an American history magazine, or perhaps about the Parashim, or maybe about Louis Brandeis, the type of place one would try to place an article like that would be American History magazine. But if I tried to do that, it would not be published. And the way I know that is because a few years ago, our organization, the Council for the National Interest, tried to place a paid advertisement in American History magazine. Magazines are desperate for advertising. That's what pays their bills. So we tried to place a paid advertisement, not for my book, for another book, an autobiography of a 91-year-old former Republican congressman that told about his long life. But we were told by the owner of American History magazine that because our organization was, quote, anti-Israel, they would not publish any advertisements by us. And in fact, Eric Weider told us, he volunteered, that they would not publish the advertisement in any of the magazines they own, which is just about every popular history magazine in the United States. According to their website, this is the largest history chain, magazine chain in the world. And yet, interestingly, one would think that all Americans would be hugely pro-Israel after decades of manipulation and filtered reporting, that everyone would be avidly pro-Israel, since of course our policies are, and our media largely are. But it's very interesting. It turns out, and some are, millions are, but the large majority of Americans in surveys say that they don't wish our government to take sides. That's a remarkable and very strong position, because that means we would not give Israel $10 million per day unless we're going to give it to both. That means if we took what the American public want, that we would not veto resolutions on behalf of Israel, that we would not have all these special weapons programs that benefit Israel, etc. It's actually a very sane response. But we're not getting that yet from our politicians, because most of the people don't know very much about it and aren't really talking about it and aren't voting on it. So right now, we're not getting what the majority wants. We're not getting policies that actually, instead of increasing violence, could actually decrease violence. And I don't think we'll get them until we tell other Americans what's going on, and until we all tell our elected representatives and our candidates that we will not vote for them unless they stand up for rational and moral policies in Israel-Palestine. If they don't do that, they will not get our votes. Until we do that, the situation we see today will continue to get worse. Thank you.
And to illustrate what we're up against, another home demolition in Jerusalem. Palestinians are forbidden building permits, and when they build anyway, their home is demolished, they're fined, and they're homeless.
ولو هو مش منباني انا يعني مش حجر عامل اسبست يعني والكرميد هو عمله ما عمل ولا شيء غلط
انهدت بالثلج
وهدوها بالثلج وهيك صار وما هو بلغش الحكومه انه نزل الثلج عليه وعود عمل
بالثلج. من ايش اسمك حجة؟
اسمي انا ام رفيق السليمي.
ومين اللي ساكن في العمارة؟
ابني.
وكم نفر ساكنين هناك؟
معنا 7 وهو ومرته 9.
وين راح يروحوا يعني بعد؟
شو بعرفني وين بدهم يروحوا؟ هم إلهم بس صغيرة.
Last year, Israel demolished 50 homes in East Jerusalem. Another 20,000 homes have demolition orders pending. In future shows, video from our workshop, Extremist Saudi Arabia and How to Expose It, and Left Forum talks about the Syrian Revolution. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.